We heard about how the stay-at-home daughter movement affected women's relationships, romantic and otherwise, in the first part of this series. In this part, we'll explore what exactly the movement is and who propelled it forward. Welcome to episode 2 of the Daughters documentary. This episode is entitled Exploring the History and Beliefs of the Stay-at-Home Daughter Movement. I'm Joanna Adams, your host. There isn't only one source. Trista Anderson, who was part of a cult that turned polygamist, told me that a desire to follow old culture was the basis for the teachings. Teachers like Debbie Pearl of Greater Joy Ministries and her book, Created to be His Helpmeet, are worth mentioning for its promotion of extreme gender roles and Debbie's advice that abused women try to be better wives. However, through the research and interview process, two significant groups came up: Bill Gothard's Institute in Basic Life Principles and Doug Phillips' Vision Forum. In the end, no matter where it came from, the main message coming from these teachers was that women should not leave their parents' house until marriage, and marriage should be the ultimate goal for girls and women. As Rebecca Hargraves put it,
a daughter is either at home under her father's protection, or she is married under the protection of her husband.
The Institute in Basic Life Principles, IBLP for short, was originally organized in 1961 in Chicago under the name Campus Teams. According to the Institute's account of its history, the founder, Bill Gothard, focused on helping teenagers and their parents make wise choices. The organization did this by working with church youth groups, high school Bible clubs, youth camps, families in crisis, and inner-city gangs. Eventually, settling on its current name in the late 1980s, the Institute has been no small force. Its teachings and seminars have been most notably followed by the Duggar family of TLC's 19 Kids and Counting. Former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee was quoted on the Institute's website calling the basic seminar, quote, "some of the best programs available for instilling character into the lives of people," NBC News reported. The IBLP has facilities in multiple countries and developed a homeschool curriculum and other books. In 2001, for example, the Institute colleged $41 million in revenue. Even in its worst years, the Institute still brought in millions of dollars. The Institute's teachings center around the umbrella analogy. In the Training Faithful Men resource manual on page 71, Gothard teaches, quote, how to guard your sons and daughters from destructive temptations. He writes, explain God's umbrella of protection. Your children must understand that as long as they are under your authority, they are protected from destructive temptation. However, if they get out from under your authority, they expose themselves to the realm and power of Satan's control. This requires that you have no leaks in your umbrella and that you never instruct your children to do evil. The umbrella started with God, then the father of the family, then the mother, then the children. Parents had to approve of all marriages. Anything less would lead to future marriage problems, according to Gothard's teachings. Emily Anderson grew up under the Institute's teachings.
I got involved through Bill Gothard's cult, IBLP, or the Institute in Basic Life Principles. And he had a subsect of that cult called ATI, or the Advanced Training Institute. And that's really what my family was involved in. And that's where I learned about the stay-at-home daughter movement, and the principles that are taught within that movement are that girls need to be under the protection of male headship at all times. So when they are single, that means being under the protection of their father. And when they're married, that means being under the protection of their husband. In order to stay under the authority or protection of a male figure, that means that girls raised in the stay-at-home daughter movement are not allowed to live on their own without having male headship over them. So you see these young women, if they don't get married when they're young, possibly they could be in their 30s. I've seen even into their early 40s where they are still, as a single woman, living under their parents' roof. And part of the stay-at-home daughter movement is that a woman should not earn income for herself, or if she does, it's in a very limited capacity with only a few professions that are allowed. But it can be very harmful when you teach these women that they can't get a higher education, they can't create a career for themselves, they can't really create any kind of independence. Any of the ATI campuses, any kind of interaction between male and female was not permitted. So whether that was at what they call training centers, which were usually various old hotels where they would hold conferences, and they would have like teenagers and young adults come up there to serve in the ministry for so many months or years. And so whether it was a training center or it was headquarters or it was Verity, you couldn't have like male and female students couldn't have conversations together. There was no unchaperoned time with each other.
Martha Ardiomenko attended the Institute's seminars where she heard stories warning women of the dangers they faced without the protection of male authority.
The story of Dinah was always brought up, that she went out to see the land and she came out from underneath her dad's authority and then she got raped.
Oh,
and so,
okay.
Basically, I had one friend that told me that her daughter never went to a store ever without her brother or her dad, because otherwise she'd be raped. You're not alone with a man, or else it's basically your fault if something happens. You had to think about, are you going to be coming to harm because you dressed the wrong way?
Okay.
Your dress wasn't long enough. Your hair, you spent too much time on your hair. And you're talking about like Mennonite type clothes.
Sure.
If they're having like tempting thoughts and stuff, they just need to get married so they can have sex. I think what happens is that you have the stay-at-home daughter movement, and it just impacts all these other things that go into other places.
Sure.
So the women being oppressed and being like, you can't think for yourself, you can't talk for yourself, you can't, almost read the Bible for yourself. You need to make sure that everything goes through a man.
Yeah.
It caused problems with our other female relationships. And so I didn't really hear from them very much after that for quite a long time.
Okay. And you told them at that point, what was your response when they asked you,
I kind of just laughed it off. I didn't really say much.
Sure.
I was worried, like you're thinking you're doing what's God's will.
Mm-hmm.
That was the big thing. So I felt like if I spoke against it, I'm speaking against God.
Right.
And I think that's one of the main facets of this whole belief system.
Right.
You're trying to please God, and these man-made rules with a doctrine of, if you do everything right, if you submit to your dad, you submit to your, family members, like the right way, you're going to be blessed. This
Right.
prosperity gospel of this.
Right.
Martha wasn't necessarily immediately sold on the ideas Gothard taught.
Well, so my family was a little different than some of them because they were not like super hardcore into like, girls need to stay at home all the time. So we but all our friends were. So, parents, they tend to be well, this must be the right thing, So we kind of went through this transition of I'm preparing to always dreaming of going to college and those kind of things to no, it's not a good idea and you can't go.
Okay.
you
Sure.
know and I think that was really hard for me because I was a very education driven person. I didn't want to get married. I wanted to be a missionary and go to nursing school. It was hard for me to wrap my head around this is the only right way to be at home and be we went to Bill Gothard's seminars, to basic life seminars. And I kept asking a lot of questions because I'm like, I just don't see this in the Bible. Like you have to listen to your parents and everything. And even after you get married, if they tell you not to go to a certain church, you shouldn't go.
Sure. Wow.
And most of our friends were that way. So it was hard because I was kind of labeled as maybe more rebellious because I didn't just accept it.
Martha struggled with the concept, partially because of the lack of a positive relationship with her father, and at the time, the lack of a husband.
And I think those voices in your head that you're raised with, you should be under someone's authority. And especially for me, because not only, with not having a husband, but my dad he's not a good person and he's gone. He's out of my life.
Right.
And so I don't even have that.
Yeah.
It's not like you can go. And I remember asking someone that was in there, I was like, if you don't have a husband, you don't have a dad, then what are you supposed to do?
Right. And what was her response?
Am I under, and I'm like, aren't I under God's umbrella?
Right.
Well, you should probably find a man in the church that you can be underneath. So I feel like it's idolized to a point where we've created this own doctrine that sends it just trickles down into every aspect of the life of these people afterwards. And there's some amazing people who have done this and have wonderful marriages, great families. But one of them, I remember her telling me, like, I didn't realize I could ask my husband and ask him questions about a decision he made. And I'm really upset about this decision he made. He had no idea. And then he's upset later when he finds out because I didn't express it. And it caused problems in their marriage because she didn't feel like she could ask him, well, why are we eating dinner at 4:00?
Right.
Then she's resentful of it. And he's like, well, I thought you wanted to.
Right. So the communication is breaking down a lot.
And so that's what I'm saying. Like, even in the good marriages, it causes problems.
Right.
Because you've been taught you don't ask questions, you don't speak up. They're your authority in everything.
Bill Gothard and the Institute weren't the only organizations that contributed to the movement. There was also Vision Forum, which was founded in 1998 by Doug Phillips. A 2013 article published in The Atlantic explained Vision Forum was actually comprised of two companies, the nonprofit Vision Forum Ministry, which had about $3.3 million in revenue in 2011, and a for-profit with a very similar name. Vision Forum Ministries sold books, magazines, children's toys, and created a very successful annual film festival in San Antonio, Texas, called Christian Filmmakers Academy. The nonprofit portion of the organization shuttered in 2013 when Phillips resigned in the wake of a lengthy extramarital affair, The Atlantic reported at the time. Emily Anderson said Vision Forum's teachings were similar to Bill Gothard's.
There were other organizations that propelled the stay-at-home daughter movement. It was very common in independent fundamentalist Baptist churches. Also, another cult leader, Doug Phillips, who ran the organization Vision Forum. He had some loose connections to Bill Gothard, and he also really was a big proponent of the stay-at-home daughter movement. And Vision Forum would produce documentaries and other material teaching the benefits of being a stay-at-home daughter. There's definitely a lot of cultural references. There would be stories that they would pull out of the Old Testament where they could make a case that a daughter was outside and not underneath the authority of her father, and some kind of harm happened to her, perhaps a rape, an attack, something like that. And they said, well, that's because she left the authority of her father.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say there weren't very many hard, fast rules in my home as far as you're not allowed to do X, Y, Z. But rather, when you are indoctrinated daily with a belief system that is primarily fueled by fear, I made my own choices. And I would even say that when I would talk to others that were outside the movement, that this is my choice. I'm not forced to do this. This is my choice. This is my own personal conviction. This is what I want to do.
Right.
And so, it wasn't really my choice because I was being indoctrinated.
Deanna Coughlin had a closer connection to Vision Forum. Her father worked for it during her childhood. Vision Forum had many materials promoting the stay-at-home ideology, including a documentary entitled The Return of the Daughters and a book written by Anna Sophia Botkin and Elizabeth Botkin entitled So Much More. In the book, So Much More, the women wrote, "Every woman's life is built around men and men's role and leadership in some way. And, quote, one of the ways I show submission to my father is by asking his opinion. Daddy is my God-given authority. I want to honor him by knowing his thoughts and views so that I can properly represent him and be able to understand and articulate what I believe. He enjoys answering my questions and helping me to search the scriptures. If he, for instance, has a preference in colors that I wear, I seek to honor him by finding that out and dressing in a way that would please him." So how old would you have been at that point when your dad started working there?
At that point, I would have been around 11. And
Okay.
it took a couple of years for it to all really set in because we didn't, for instance, stop. For me, that was the external thing that caused me the most personal discomfort because it was just so hot all the time. And I hated having to wear long skirts instead of being able to wear shorts, in particular because we live in Texas. And for a few of those years, we didn't have AC in our house.
Oh,
We
yeah.
were roughing it in long skirts. We wanted to move to Texas as a family to be closer to my mom's parents and all of her siblings who were very close to myself and my siblings in ages. And Vision Forum was a wholesome, family-oriented job. And my dad landed it from Ohio, and we moved for the job. My mom liked to get the catalogs, and we would look at the toys and little doll dresses and stuff in there. And they liked the message that was being preached of rebuilding the Christian family in America. As a child, I remember being annoyed that as Vision Forum divided things up, the boys had all of these fun, interesting toys. And
Not.
yeah, as an
Yeah.
11-year-old, that was the thing that stood out to me. And the divide just became clear on several different levels as I matured. And
Right.
I started noticing how boys had all of this preference and all of this freedom and this worldview, and girls were supposed to just sit down and do home stuff and cook and raise the babies and applaud the boys on their manly achievements. I feel that when people say stay-at-home daughter, it's usually religious, and where it comes from. It's this idealization of young girls as being meek and under authority and complying with the quote-unquote proper authorities in their lives. And there are families that I've known who didn't put so much emphasis on the authority aspect of it, but I think that most of the people I have known, that has been a big part of it, is making sure that the woman stays under the authority she's supposed to be listening to. So a girl needs to stay home under her father's authority until she gets married, and then she transitions under her husband's authority. A lot of times there's an umbrella metaphor that's used. The Old Testament, I can't think of any verses in particular right now that say, young women can't move out, but it was all idealized, I guess, from all of the images in the Bible of, the bride and how it's framed and, the way that culture worked, where women, stayed indoors in a lot of times, and they would, leave in this big ceremonial ritual to go from one house to the other.
The Vision Forum philosophy was so persuasive that it encouraged Rebecca Hargraves to not only follow these beliefs, but be an active promoter of them. At one point, she planned to write a book about them.
And so we see these teachings about women, and the stay-at-home daughterhood movement took them to then be law for all times, all places, all cultures, to where when I was smack dab in the middle of the stay-at-home daughterhood movement, and at the age of 15, so if you're doing the math, a year after finding out about this movement, I was blogging and writing weekly about stay-at-home daughterhood. I had plans to write and publish a book, hopefully through Vision Forum, entitled Stay-at-Home Daughterhood, Defined, Defended, and Delighted in which I would, in the first part of the book, I was going to define what stay-at-home daughterhood was. In the second part, I was going to defend it with scripture. And in the third part, I was going to share how you could delight in it and what you could do as a stay-at-home daughter.
From her perspective, the movement was more about the patriarchy than religion.
Well, I'm sure there are people out there who aren't even religious in any way that practice this type of lifestyle. It's primarily something that is driven, even more than driven by Christianity, because I don't want to give Christianity a bad name. I am a Christian, absolutely. But it is something that is driven by the philosophy of patriarchy more than anything. The philosophy, I would say, that drives it more than anything, more than even just Christianity or a legalistic form of Christianity, really is the philosophy of patriarchy. And that is a philosophy that you see in a multitude of world religions. You see it in the Middle East, in Islam. You see it in certain sects of Christianity. So I would say more than even it just being a religious philosophy that's driving stay-at-home daughterhood, it would first and foremost be the philosophy of patriarchy. The stay-at-home daughterhood movement is but an offshoot of the movement of patriarchy, which through my research and having been involved in a ministry that taught Christian patriarchy, I see that the stay-at-home daughterhood movement was something that was started in order to safeguard Christian women in a desire to insulate them against the influence of third wave secular feminism. In reference to this movement is Numbers chapter 30. And in that chapter, we see this aspect of the law of God and the Old Testament law given to Israel, where a woman she vows a vow, okay? And her husband hears it. And he says, oh, that vow, that's not good for you. That was not wise. He can release her from that vow. The same goes for a daughter at home under her husband, under her father, If she vows a vow to the Lord, her father hears it and says, oh, that's not a good idea. That was hasty, unwise, what have you. Then he can step in and negate that vow and release his daughter from that. But then the passage says, but a widowed or unmarried woman, I don't know if it says divorced, but a widowed, unmarried woman, it may also say divorced, has to basically uphold her own vows. She doesn't have anyone to free her from potentially dangerous vows that she has vowed. She has to fulfill those. Now, that passage is used to say that, okay, here's this picture. A daughter is either at home under her father's protection, or she is married under the protection of her husband, or else you have these lone wolves, these women to be pitied, these unmarried, divorced, widowed women who have no protection. And people take that to be law because it was part of the Old Testament law, but what is not understood is our relationship to the Old Testament law as New Testament believers. And the fact that not only are we not beholden to all of those ceremonial, sacrificial, all of those laws today, that passage wasn't even really talking about whether or not you can live away from your father and be unmarried. It didn't even talk about that, because the thing is, it's not that patriarchy is the teaching of the Bible. It's that patriarchy is the backdrop against which the Bible is portrayed. In other words, patriarchy was the teaching of the day. It was the cultural norm, but it was not what God designed.
Trista Anderson summed up the patriarchal mentalities as, quote, from an old culture.
With my knowledge of cultures and studying the Bible, which we did so much of, I feel like a lot of the philosophy behind this teaching comes from an Old Testament cultural bias. Mm-hmm. And when you start doing an Old Testament cultural, history type stuff, and even look at that area of the world right now, you're still even gonna see a lot of those tendencies, a lot of oppression of women, a lot of the more women have a certain place in society, and that's the only place they belong. And when we as a culture try to take on other cultures, I think that's where we start seeing a lot of the problems start happening. Mm-hmm. So for me, that's where, I kind of see that now.
In the next episode, we'll explore how the movement affected education and careers. Thank you for listening to The Daughters, a documentary examining the stay-at-home daughter movement with myself as the host, Joanna Adams. Thank you to Jake Musiker for audio production. Writing and editing by Shalom, Baer, G. Music credit to the Aegis Destroyer by PC3. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow the show on Facebook at The Daughters Docu and on this podcast's website, www.thedaughtersdocu.com.